I love rural ministry, and it has a special place in my heart. The rural communities all across the U.S. and Canada, it's my heart and soul. I'll never forget visiting years ago, when I first started out in ministry, I'll never forget visiting a parishioner, a farmer. He was recently widowed. And I was sitting with him on his front porch, and he wants to talk about Aristotle and Plato and Wendell Berry and if the corn is going to come in good. And it was just, I was thinking, I didn't learn this in seminary, but this is ministry. This is ministry. And so our presenter today is Colin Nicolle. Our rural communities are struggling. And Colin has some very unique and fascinating project about the story of one particular rural community. Colin is an ordinand in the Anglican Church of Canada from Cole Harbour, but he himself has served in rural settings in Prince Edward Island. So let's welcome Colin.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Wilhock, and for your guidance through this whole year. In 2015, a report was released by an organization called the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. The report was a sort of State of the Union of rural Canada, and it begins like this. We have been neglecting rural Canada. Despite the vital role of rural places in this country, and despite their partnership with urban Canada, we have been neglecting rural places and permitting the erosion of an important community development foundation of Canadian society and economy. Fundamentally, we have forgotten how to reinvest in small town places. The rest of the report is grim. The section on Nova Scotia reports that between 2010 and 2014, the population of every single county in Nova Scotia, except for 2, has declined. One county in those 4 years saw a 10% population decline. The report also reminds us that Nova Scotia has the second oldest population in Canada, second only to New Brunswick. Now, even though this report focuses mostly on the economic future of rural Canada, many of us who come from rural churches or communities, or who minister to them, know that these are not just problems of the secular world. The impact on our rural congregations is great. Outmigration, aging populations, declining birth rates, and economic struggles. These are all problems that are having an enormous impact on our rural congregations. As a student, I have served parishes both in rural Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, and during my time in these places, I have developed a heart for rural ministry, but also grew increasingly concerned about the ways that the problems I spoke of a moment ago are harming those rural congregations. And this is why I was so encouraged and excited when I first heard about the initiative that 3 young people were undertaking in a parish in rural Nova Scotia last summer, and why I chose to conduct a case study on this event for my graduate project. In the summer of 2015, 3 students, all under the age of 28, went to live and work in a rural parish, which for the purposes of anonymity, I will be calling St. Gregorys. St. Gregorys is a rural multi-point parish in the Nova Scotia countryside that was struggling financially and had lost their full-time priest only about 7 months earlier due to financial problems. The students' vision of the project was part intentional community, part radical hospitality, and part pastoral care. Their plan was to live in the empty rectory, dedicate themselves to the work of pastoral care, and to model their time and the rhythms and structure of their time after a monastery. They said morning and evening prayer every day through the week in all points of the parish. They shared meals together. They opened their house to the parish for social events, and they sought to reconnect with those who had fallen away from the church. They provided Sunday services, preached, visited parishioners, led study groups, vacation Bible schools, and even started a choir that continues to this day. What captured me about this initiative and drew me to making it the subject of my grad project was that the spirit of what the students were trying to do speaks to me as a young Christian. In fact, one of the students during an interview told me that they found it hard for people older than them to really grasp the vision that they were trying to put forward. But to many of the young people they encountered who had left cities in search of smaller and more authentic communities, the idea of attempting to revitalize a rural parish, focusing on building community in meaningful ways, and living lives together committed to a single cause made all the sense in the world. I suppose that I am one of those young people. I have seen the ways that rural parishes struggle, and I've seen the ways that life can be breathed back into them. I don't try to pigeonhole the St. Gregorys Project as an example of fresh expression, or even as something particularly new or innovative, but I do see it as a step in the right direction. I see it as a bold statement to our churches of two things. The first is that amidst the despair that reports like the one I mentioned in the beginning can stir up for us, there are other options that our churches can consider before closing or amalgamating rural parishes. And second, there are young people in our churches who care about the church and desire to see it live, and live abundantly. And so way back in the fall of this year, I proposed the question, can students revitalize a rural parish? And this is the question that would guide my research and my interviewing in the entirety of this case study. As I would come to find out, the answer is not as clear-cut or as simple as this question makes it seem. What makes a case study different from some of the other methodological approaches that you'll be hearing about today and tomorrow is that rather than studying particular experiences or a phenomenon, the case study is an in-depth description and analysis of a bounded system. This means that the subject of a case study has to be an event or a series of events that can be fenced in by time or space. A researcher should be able to take the subject of a case study and limit the scope of the study by time or by a geographic place. So, for example, I'm not studying all cases of young people serving rural parishes, but the young people who served this rural parish at this particular time. And because of the narrow scope of the project, I did not seek out participants through an open call, but rather I first consulted the students themselves, learned more about the project, and then began to contact people in the parish so that my data came from different experiences and people with varying levels of involvement in the life of the parish. In total, I interviewed 6 participants, 3 of whom were men and 3 were women. Although for the purposes of anonymity, I will give my participants unisex names and will refer from identifying them by their gender. None of my participants are ordained clergy, and none have ever pursued studies in ministry. All of my participants, except for one, Pat, grew up in some Christian context, and all now identify as Christians, except for one participant who identifies as an atheist. Let me introduce you to them. First, there's Pat. Pat is in their mid-20s and was raised with no religious background, but first encountered Anglicanism through a university chaplaincy program. Morgan is again in their mid-20s and was raised in a Christian denomination and, like Pat, became an Anglican in university. Alex is a bit older than Pat and Morgan, and like Morgan was raised in a Christian context but encountered Anglicanism later in life through a university chaplaincy program. And in the parish, there's Terry. Terry is a longtime member of the St. Gregorys congregation and has raised their children in the church. Terry is currently one of the lay leaders within the congregation. And there's Chris. Chris was raised at St. Gregorys, but fell away for some time and says that it was only about 15 years ago that they really began to attend more frequently. Chris knows the parish well and has served on various committees throughout the last 15 years. And finally, there's Vic. Vic is the newcomer to the parish. Vic is a self-described atheist and moved to the community surrounding St. Gregorys about 7 years ago for work. Vic's involvement with the parish began this summer after encountering the St. Gregorys Project, and Vic's continued involvement is quite limited. One of the questions I asked the students in the interview, which I will come to a bit later, was how they understood their mission work in the parish. Not what the written mission statement was, but how did they see and understand their goals for the summer? The responses I received from them told me that the mission of this project had deep roots in both the Holy Scriptures and theology. Rather than seeing this as a practical improvement project of good works, the nature of the students' answers to my questions told me that they understood their work to be a sort of blossoming of what we are called to do in Scripture. Even their days were framed by a reading of Scripture and by prayer through their saying of morning and evening prayer each day. One of the students told me, "It's beautiful, it's just so beautiful to rest your life on the church's reading of Scripture." But we don't need to look past Matthew 28 to find the justification for Christians to engage in any sort of mission. Jesus charged his disciples, and through time charges us, to go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Mission is, in the words of missiologist Paul Hertig, a moment of dismantling the dividing wall between us and the other. But it was theologian Leslie Newbegin's definition of mission that I found specifically fit the nature of what I was hearing from the students. He said this, that mission is particular enterprises within the total mission of the church, which have the primary intention of bringing into existence a Christian presence in a milieu where previously there was no such presence, or where such a presence was ineffective. The students saw a place where the Christian presence was not working effectively, and they attempted, through their various acts of mission, to do as Jesus charges his followers to do. But the project also raises questions about who it is that can do mission, especially of the sort that they were involved in. Consider for a moment the outsiderness of the students. None were raised as Anglicans. They all came to or came back to a lively and active faith within the last few years. And there was only some experience in rural parishes between them all. This outsiderness should remind us of that really great parishioner, Paul of Tarsus, who began his ministry very much from the outside, even having persecuted Christians. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus came later in his life, but soon after, he was on his way to the many major city centers in his world, spreading the gospel and helping the churches there. Paul is often painted as an itinerant preacher, but theologian and missiologist David Bosch points out that Paul often stayed for long periods of time, helping the churches get established before moving on. The students at St. Gregorys, far from being itinerant preachers, saw their time as limited, and like St. Paul, saw themselves more as supports and encouragements than leaders, with the hope that in time the parish would raise up hope and leaders for itself. Pat also told me that one aspect of their vision for the summer came from recalling the parable of the lost sheep. Pat said this, "You have to make sense of the parable of the lost sheep. It doesn't make sense to go searching for that one lost sheep, yet that's what it calls us to do. If we're going to live like Jesus, let's care for all 100 sheep." I've spoken a bit already about the vision of the project, but there's much more to say. This project was not undertaken during a high point in St. Gregory's history. Their finances were seriously depleted, and the parish could no longer afford full-time ministry. Chris, the parishioner, said this, "It's been a slow death. It's basically just waiting until the money runs out, and that's the reality." Chris, who is in their mid-40s, also pointed to the declining numbers in the church as being a contributing factor to the parish's decline. "It's been in despair for some time, actually. I'm the youngest person in that church by 20 years. And Terry, the lay leader in the church, describes a sort of stagnancy. Routine, routine, routine. Some people found that there was no challenge or anything new. The students' vision of their work there was realistic. They knew that in the time they had, they could not turn back the clock on years of decline, but that wasn't their hope. Alex said, "We wanted to plant in the imagination of folks different kinds of meetings and of community, study groups and services, and the practice of hospitality. Once the students arrived there, they found that planting these things in the imagination of the parish meant a lot of footwork. Morgan said, on the ground it had a lot more to do with connecting people and connecting the church to the surrounding communities. Morgan also described the difficulty of moving to St. Gregorys and seeing a community rife with opportunity, but a church that could no longer seize those opportunities. The area is growing in a beautiful way. There's a lot of young professional people starting up initiatives, and they're all very community-minded. It's amazing, but the church is closing just as the community is building up. Pat saw the despair that gripped the parish and hoped that, if anything, the students could at least offer some release from that. The biggest need we saw was the need for a real shifting of the focus of the parish. That is, a bit of a relaxing of the death grip and serious despair that was crushing the place. When the students finally settled into the parish rectory and began their work, there was very little happening through the week except the Sunday services. Their hope was not to fill their days with a burdensome number of options for parishioners to take part in, but to focus on services, outreaches, and activities that would connect the parishioners to each other, the community to the parish, and set a tone of hope for the time that would follow the summer. Morgan immediately set out into the community to make connections to musicians and the surrounding arts community. I met local musicians in the nearby town and connected with the Baptist church that would help us lead a Duke of Edinburgh camping trip later in the summer. These connections of just introducing themselves to local people and being visible in the community led to connections that would help the students develop a series of charitable benefit concerts throughout the summer. These concerts were open to the community and were all quite successful at drawing in new faces and money for local charities such as the local women's shelter. Vic, the newcomer to the parish, whose first exposure to Anglicanism was through this project, saw the power in events like these concerts for the ways that they connected to the whole community. Vic said, so there's a fundraising concert for the local shelter where there will not be a collection and where there will not be a prayer. It was ecumenical in the capital E way. Visitation was a major focus for the students as well. They all had a strong sense that they couldn't properly engage in this work and serve the congregation unless they knew who they were ministering to. Alex said, I felt at sea talking from a pulpit to people, trying to make the gospel relevant to people if I had no clue who I was talking to. Their time was also marked by morning and evening prayer together each day, and though the response from the different points of the parish varied at times, Vic, who first found out about the project by seeing a sign for evening prayer on the side of the road, saw the power in what it communicated to the parish and the community. I really respect them, especially that practice of consistency. I think it's a big part of building trust. The prospect of doing 3 services a day was genius. There's something about commitment and sincerity that really matters here. The project, though, faced many challenges. One of the things that emerged from my interviews with both students and the parish was that both sides felt the absence of any kind of daily pastoral support for the students. The parish did have a priest in charge through the summer who would be in the parish at least once a month for a communion service, but St. Gregory's priest in charge did not live in the area. The students noted that when difficulties arose between them or members of the congregation, they needed more support than just themselves. Morgan told me, we kind of failed to minister to each other, and we were also lacking someone who was ministering to us. And Pat said, we did not have an ordained spiritual leader that we could turn to on a daily basis. When we arrived, there was nobody we could just turn to and say, let's go for a beer. Their comments highlight an important aspect, not just of this kind of student ministry, but ministry in general. The loneliness and isolation that can come from being new to a community and in a position of leadership. Put bluntly, pastors need pastors. But it wasn't just the students that noticed this. Terry said, it was very difficult for them, I think. They didn't really have a supervisor or leader per se. Interestingly, it was Vic, the newcomer, who made ministering to the students a priority. and Vic's impact on the students was so great that each of them mentioned in their interviews how important Vic's support was throughout the summer. Morgan said, "Vic was our greatest pastoral support, except for when the priest in charge was there. Vic would always chat after Compline and help us see what people's fears were, how their needs work, and how this was affecting our relationships. I heard from Vic that their ministry offered to the students was a response to what the students were offering to the community." Vic said, "I think it's the least we can do for each other. If they are willing to do it for us, we can do it for them." As I've alluded to in other parts of my presentation thus far, both the parishioners and the students experienced the burdensome weight and difficulty of walking with the community through the sort of trouble St. Gregorys had been experiencing. My participants described it with such strong words as hopelessness, despair, death grip, and finally, fear. For many of the participants, the collective fear of the community over its unstable future was palpable. Vic, the newcomer, had seen it before. Vic said, "Fear, the panicky, very urgent feeling. The fear of money running out can eclipse every other way of thinking and seeing. The feeling of being a non-renewable resource is pretty scary." The challenge the students faced was how to approach this fear and despair. Pat spoke of it this way: "The two biggest challenges were money and the question of where do we find the truth. Do we find it in dollars and cents, or do we find it somewhere else?" We were going with a focus on health and community, and they were focusing on what was necessary to make finances healthy in the short term. The students were aware that the hype around their project may have made them seem like a financial silver bullet, but it was never their vision. But this highlights another major challenge that several of my participants told me about, which was communication. Terry, the parish leader, experienced problems with communication even in the planning stages. Terry describes sparse contact with the parish during the initial planning of the project, miscommunication about the numbers of students who would even be participating in the project, and generally unhelpful communication from those on the student side of things. Terry put it bluntly: communication was absolutely atrocious. The communication was part of a larger problem of poor organization, but these are problems that could be mitigated through earlier and more careful consultation with the parish leadership. Terry, the lay reader, went on to say, "It could be a positive thing provided in the beginning time, training, communication, planning, and everything was put in place with the students as well as the wardens, and that the priest in charge did the initial plan and got everything in place." In my interviews with the student participants, I asked them about what it was like to live together to do this work, and in each case these were the longest responses that I received from them. Their answers reveal something important, that being supportive of one another and having support is key. Alex told me that the anxieties and wedges that existed within the parish found their way into the rectory, and that it was a constant struggle to protect their friendship from division and hurt. Pat, who was the most affected by the interpersonal struggle in the rectory, offered the greatest wisdom on the topic. Pat said, "You can't imagine how important humility is in that context. It is actually the difference between killing your neighbor and loving them. You have to be supportive of one another if you're going to do this, and you have to recognize when you aren't being this way, because you can't be supportive at all times." The daily offices were not only a crucial part of the prayer life and structure that the students gave to the parish, but helped them to navigate the difficulties of ministry and living in community. The real power of the daily offices for the students were in what strength they offered them amidst turbulent times in their relationships. Alex said, "When we really weren't seeing eye to eye on things, to go to the offices and to sit in the choir facing one another and say the prayers, more than a few times it had been a real moment of conversion for us to walk away from the church in a completely different way." From my interviews with the students, I gathered that to them, this was not a pass-fail or succeed, don't succeed sort of situation, but it was rather an act of love and support, an attempt to walk with a parish that was hurting and to care for it. Both Terry and Chris, the parishioners at St. Gregory's, told me that in the parish's eyes, the project was helpful and successful in some ways, but not in others. One of the things I asked them was how things have changed since the students left. Chris said, "I'd like to say yes, I'd love to say yes, that things have changed, but I can't. The situation has just gone too far, and there's no sense of hope with most people." Terry told me that from the perspective of the lay leadership, the students were a help, but to date, we have not really come ahead that much more. Terry also told me that the students' mandate that the parish received when the summer began was to pray daily, to visit parishioners, to practice radical hospitality, to engage young people in the area, and to generally give themselves wholeheartedly to ministry in an attempt to make the parish viable. By this standard, there are some successes that grew out of this project. Every single participant told me in their interviews about the phenomenon of the Thursday evening Compline service. Compline, or night prayers, is another prayer office of the church, like morning or evening prayer, that dates back about 1,500 years. It's a very quiet, calm, and contemplative service said at night, and is often, as was the case at St. Gregory's, said by candlelight. Soon after the students began saying the service on Thursday, new people began arriving each week. Most of the attendees came from outside the parish, some from other denominations, but many from none. Chris saw it as an example of the ways that the students did manage to connect parish to community. Chris said, "I was impressed with how these young people were able to get so many people from outside the parish together into a sense of community. The biggest hit of the summer that got people in was Compline." When I spoke to Vic about Compline, I received a laugh and this response. Vic said, "And so I start going to the services, and I start bringing other people to the services. You know, that's a strange thing for an atheist to be doing. Proselytizing to my other non-religious friends." Vic's profession is teaching, and through teaching, Vic has seen class after class of students bring spiritual crises into the classroom. In Vic's eyes, they're doing this because they are severely spiritually malnourished, and the church has not taken a place in their lives to feed them. It was through Compline that Vic saw the sort of support, community, and spiritual healing that so many students are in need of. Vic said, "I'm seeing this commitment to practices of community that I respect, and it's pulling on my heartstrings because I see the way that my students have been abandoned in their spiritual development." Eventually, Morgan began to offer public lessons for singing the office of Compline and invited people of any skill level to come and practice and hopefully form a small Compline choir on Thursday nights. Before long, the choir alone had expanded to well over 15 people, and Compline began to grow. As of the end of these interviews, towards the beginning of 2016, the Compline service and choir was still being held each Thursday under the St. Gregory's lay leadership. So what does this project tell us, and where do we go from here? One of the questions I asked my participants was whether they thought that this project was important, and if so, how? Terry and Chris both reflected on it and curiously told me almost exactly the same thing. They said, with some longing in their voices, that St. Gregory's deeply needed a project like this, but they needed it 2 years ago. Chris said, "Having an introduction of summer students like this needs to be earlier, before people give up, before people just don't see any future whatsoever." Both Terry and Chris's responses reinforced for me the importance of timing a project like this, but also reminded me of the destructive power of despair that can befall and infect churches. The students can see the ways that the church and secular society can often put more focus and value on larger centers of people rather than on rural and isolated areas. And this reinforced for them the important place that churches need to take as centers of community life in small and struggling rural places. Morgan said, "It really seems to me that the church, that is the wider church, has abandoned their small communities. I think it's shown in having churches closed most of the time. People can't even go in to pray. People no longer see these spaces as safe places anymore." And Alex said, "There were other people seeking small community, and there was no dissonance for them between the life that they're seeking in the countryside and saying 1,500-year-old prayers in a dark church. It opens up a part of the soul that's always been there for them, and they didn't even know it. This project mattered not because it was unique or because it did anything particularly well, as Pat told me, but because it was an act of hope. It mattered because it was, if nothing else, a signal to the parish, the community, and to people like Vic that the church is not dead, and that there are still people of a younger generation who are willing to offer themselves and the church as a place of hope and community. This project speaks to the church and to our theological understanding of mission in various ways. First, it tells us that students can be effective ministers of struggling rural congregations, but it is clear that timing is key. Student missioners need to be sent in before the parish loses full-time, on-site pastoral leadership, both for the sake of the students and the parish, so that a stable center of leadership exists for both. The project reveals that students can bring a variety of new ideas, bright energy, and vitality to places in need of these things. But the parish needs to be open to receiving that energy and to help the students channel it in ways that will be most helpful. The parishes as well must have an open heart. Students bring vulnerability. They have not lived through the struggles of the parish, and they are not worn down by despair. They love, and they want to be loved, and parishes must open themselves to that love and become vulnerable themselves if they want to benefit from the energy and vitality that students can bring. What this requires is an act of hope rather than despair. The tendency for many parishes, especially those being choked by despair and facing crisis and closure, is to turn inward and focus on finances and whatever other survival measures might bring them through the trenches to the bitter end. The most important thing for parishes to discover in times of crisis is their identity, their mission, and who Christ is calling them to be, because that is their only true reason to continue. No one can help parishes understand themselves like an outsider. As gracious outsiders, students can bring new levels of self-knowledge, purpose, and hope to a parish. The outsider has always been an important personage in Scripture, from the welcoming of the Gentiles into the fold of God's chosen people, and further back into Christ's own lineage, which includes a number of outsiders. It can be a great stretch for a parish to accept the views and the offerings of outsiders, such as student missionaries, but it could also be their salvation. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Do I have questions, comments?
Hi, Colin. That was fantastic. Can I just ask a couple of context-setting questions?
Sure.
One, I'm interested in the need for the anonymity of the parish. The other is, could you describe the students a little bit? Are they seminary students? Are they philosophy students?
Sure.
Are they undergrads? And how was this financed? Did they have a stipend?
Sure, that's one thing I didn't touch on. The first thing I'd say is the reason for the anonymity, the reason that I kind of focused on this in the presentation was, as you could tell, there was some issues within the parish. There were some, not fights, but it was a sore point for some people. So in the presentations, I was hoping to just anonymize people as much as possible. I'm forgetting your first question.
Just about how it was financed.
Oh, the financing.
Yeah.
On the finance side of things, the students actually applied for mission grants through the diocese. And I can ask the bishop because he's sitting right there. Is it public information or? Yeah, the students.
It is now.
No, sorry, but the amounts and everything. The students applied for quite substantial missionary grants for mission work within the diocese, and they received it, and it was enough to fund them through the summer and to fund, with some left over, fund some of the projects they did within the parish. Yeah, and as far as the students go, none of them are presently pursuing any kind of ministry stream. I know it had been considered for at least one of them. One works is still in school and is working as a music teacher. One is doing a trade program now, and the other is still at a master's level somewhere else program.
Thank you. So I just have a comment as well. I'm always quite sad that the goal of these projects has to be revitalization of a parish over the long haul. That seems to me like a phenomenal project in and of itself for the ministry of the students and the people for a short period of time. Just fantastic. Thank you.
The Thursday night service, that was a new initiative, correct?
A new initiative?
Yes.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Did the students discuss the fact that we had so many unchurched people coming to a new initiative on a Thursday night where they have no expectations, as opposed to those of us who traditionally show up on the weekend and know exactly what to do? Do you think that was an appeal for, do you think that was appealing for the unchurched to know it was a community endeavor? I don't know too much about church, and I'm going with somebody that God knows doesn't know. And was that ever made comment? Because that's exactly what provided the community base if it's continuing today.
Yeah, it's, they touched on just the surprise that there were so many people coming in that were primarily not the Sunday morning sort of parishioners, that these were people coming from a community. A lot of Baptists came, apparently. That was the sort of largest denomination represented at the Thursday service. One of the strange things about Compline, for anyone who knows it when it's candlelit, is that it's really kind of not a strange service, but sort of ethereal. Like you're in this candlelit church, you're saying that the nature of the prayers are very quiet, focused on the end of the night. I mean, it can be a very moving thing to be in, and in my experience through university chaplaincy, where Compline is said often, it has this pull and this draw for people to be the entry into this sort of Christian worship, I guess. For some reason, even though it's sort of no less about Christianity than any of the other services we offer, for some reason it can bridge this gap, and I've seen it before, between people who have no religious background, can come into it and enjoy it and not feel sort of threatened by it, I guess, and can enter into that. And I think the students found, both with some of the people of other denominations and the people who were just from the community of no denomination or they didn't know, it was this entry point in a way that the morning or the evening service or the Sunday morning service just couldn't be. So they did note how odd it was. They found that it just sort of blew up into this from basically a painted sign on the side of the road is what they did for all of these services. Hand painted a sign, and that's what drew people in. But one of them said that the power of putting candlelight service on the sign was a huge draw. There's something about that just speaks to everyone, I think. But yeah, thank you.
Katie.
Thank you, Colin. That was a great presentation, and I haven't heard it all yet. This is the first time I've heard it all, and it's funny how much our two presentations will bounce off one another. What I'm wondering about is, did the participants talk at all about kind of the hope for the future, what it might look like at, going forward? The students have left. What now for St. Gregory's?
Not a lot. I mean, we did talk about the hope that, if I could put it this way, it was sort of like small hopes, right? Like what I tried to get through with this was that nobody went into this thinking that things were going to be turned around. I mean, it wasn't the nature of the project. It wasn't the state the parish was in, was ready to be turned around by something like this. But I think the hope, as I think it was Alex said, or maybe it was Pat, but just to go in and just sort of, it was more like plant something in the mind of the people that things can be different, even if they left with just, I think one of the participants in another part of the interview said, if we can just leave with the notion that things can be different, like that's sort of sufficient, and it might not ever amount to anything, but it's just, what they saw was this sort of cloud, and just to do something to punch through that cloud and send a hand down to them would be great. Yeah.
Thanks, Colin. I enjoyed that. Maybe just comment on two aspects. One, I see the implications for every parish, every congregation in Christian education, where we're really talking about skills and information, all that sort of thing that really should every Christian should possess in some sense, whether you see that as well, and that this may be a pilot project of maybe the Holy Spirit or something going into the church to say you all have something to do here. And then the other question, the other side would be, what implications do you see for the theological school to help or perhaps be a hindrance to this kind of process?
Right, right. Well, I mean, one of the things that's sort of come out of this for me is kind of imagining, you know, like just daydreaming about, you know, if this happened again, what could this look like? And one of the things that I've thought of is depending, you know, the student participants here have had a lot of experience with church through their university career, but you know, thinking about how could we prepare students for this, and just to throw out ideas, like could there be sort of a 2-week like prep course or crash course in visiting? Because one of the things that the parishioners noted is that, you know, do the students, you know, do they have the pastoral training that we might receive at a place like AST? And the answer is they may have some experience, but in terms of formal training, no, you know, they didn't often. They did have experience, but not the training. And so how can the theological schools or the diocese, I mean, work together to sort of provide like small training for students to prepare for something like this? But so that's what sort of bounces around in my head.
So you're sort of suggesting that maybe like a theological school could take this model and send students out into rural ministry and do a similar kind of thing?
Not so much as setting up a program as such, but it seems to me that the church and the school have a common interest and mission, in the sense that what Jesus is calling out all of us to, whether you're ordained or lay or whatever, you're, you know, even an atheist, it seems. But we are being called to participate in the mission in a way that really we haven't caught well at times. And every church thinks it's just dying out, that's the end of us.
Yeah.
But in fact, they still have ministry. They still have something to, you know, to do there. And even if there are only 2 people left or whatever, wherever 2 or 3 are, he is also there. So I mean, it seemed to me that both institutions have something to kind of learn and possibly reflect on. Probably together would be better than independently.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. One back here.
Thank you, Colin. That was a really interesting presentation. I was particularly struck by the problems with communication that you spoke about, and it made me think about the settlement movement that occurred in England back in the Victorian period. So there were groups of upper class students from universities like Oxford and Cambridge that were going out into the inner cities in England, like the East End, where there wasn't a large church presence, and trying to bring church and education to the people there. And what they often ran into, the biggest problem, was this kind of culture clash where they really did not understand where the people were coming from, nor did the people living there understand them. And I was wondering whether there were any ways that you found that people were able to overcome those cultural differences, like understand each other better, because these students seem to be coming from a very different place than where the people were in the community.
Sure. There's 2 things I'd say about that. The first is that when I spoke about communication, I mean, that was, I think, more of a practical aspect of just it was poorly organized in many ways. I didn't get from the interviews that there was much of the culture clash, at least from anyone I spoke to. A lot of the studies which were on, you know, C.S. Lewis books or sort of relevant movies, they might have a movie night and study that, were all quite well received from the parish. The other thing I'd say, just from my experience with rural ministry, was that though it is a rural parish, I would probably hazard to say that the level of education is higher than in other rural parts of Nova Scotia where this was. You have, I think, more people who have sort of left and come back, or who have perhaps jobs in the city rather than sort of being really quite isolated and not left the village or wherever it is. One-track mind. The second question. Sorry?
I didn't have a second question. I was just wondering, like, so the communication problems were more about just that there wasn't enough communication going on.
Yes, sorry, I remember what I was going to say. One of the things that, it was actually Vic told me that and I didn't get a chance to find out who these people were to interview them, but Vic told me that there were some people in the wake of this that Vic heard speaking of the project in a way of, who are these students to come from the city and sort of play church in our church? This, not a sort of like imperialism, but that you're coming from this other context and trying to just drop it in and make it work here. And there was people that stepped away from the church, apparently, for the duration of the project because of that. It was something that I was kind of unfortunate I couldn't fit in time, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you also spoke about, was that the parishioners were coming from a place where they saw church as being more about people coming to church, the numbers, the money, whereas these students were seeing it more as about worship and relationships and community. And maybe there's a difference in that sense. And were they able to kind of overcome that in any way?
I don't get the sense that they were. They did talk about, and this is another thing that you just have to sort of pick and choose when you're doing this, how much to fit in. And there was a meeting they had every Monday, and the hope was to turn these meetings into not an executive meeting, not a money meeting, but almost like a visioning meeting. Like, let's get together, let's have a meal or let's have coffee, and let's just talk. Let's think about the parish, let's think about, where do we want to go? And just try and sort of inspire, like Pat or Alex said, the different sort of meetings, right, where it's not just about money. And my impression that I got from it was, for the first half of the summer, the meetings were just like this, like it was a train wreck. And it was a train wreck because a lot of times the meetings turned into discussions about finances. It was just this sort of stuck record. And the students, through the university chaplaincy, had experience with meetings like this that were very successful in sort of being a pastoral support to people who wanted to come and express the difficulties they were having within the parish, with how hurt they were by the things going on or whatever. And it wasn't until about halfway through the summer that sort of started to pick up. And I would say, in answer to your question, that seemed like the glimmer of hope of the communication between the vision and the sort of parishes being stuck on finances, was that once those meetings began to transform into people being more willing to share and talk about their needs and their difficulties, and it became more about the vision than the money. That was sort of the point at which, late in the summer, unfortunately, the two visions began to kind of meld, I think.
Hi. One right here.
Hi.
Hi.
Just in terms of rural areas and with the knowledge that up until 3 or 4 generations ago, the church was kind of the focal point of the community, and we've kind of moved away. Was there any theme at all that came about from either the student participants or the parish participants that indicated that perhaps their focus should be more, how do we build the community, and so that people know that we care before we tell them what we know, type thing?
Right. That was, I would sort of say, whenever I spoke about the students' vision as being, half about connecting with the community, that they didn't really see themselves or what they were doing as a building up of the church to then sort of pull the church, or pull the community into the religious life of the church. Their vision was that the parish could really actually be a center of like capital C community, not community for the people that go on Sunday, but that this place, and there's places, what the parish I served in for the summer for my placement, very rural, up on Canso, the Canso Peninsula, and there's churches there where, these were places with 4 or 5 stores, there were post offices, there were, and this is a place where the only vestige of community life that exists is the church, and there's 4 people that go, and they don't drive. So if that church closes, not only does that sort of the religious life, in a sense, I think it can continue, but to them, the symbol of it sort of dies out. But for a lot of people, that church is the last place where people can gather, where a community funeral can be held or anything like that. So I think there was a great sense for them that the idea of church community is capital C community, and that it has to look outside of itself to draw people in. And in a way, if people come to church on Sunday morning because of that, great. And if not, it's not hurting the community, right?
Thank you.
Colin, I'd like to ask you, if you had to make one suggestion around what would have made this a more viable experience for the parish and for people. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing you say it was supervision.
Okay.
I think supervision was a big one that I heard. I mean, obviously, I think if what the parishioners said is right 2 years ago, earlier, if we can catch this sort of early when parishes start to see the decline. As Chris actually said, I mean, he said things were bad 2 years ago, but people didn't have a sense of it yet. People hadn't lost hope. That's probably the biggest one. In terms of the student's life, it seemed to me like having the daily pastoral guidance and leadership on the ground, not by phone, but with them in the community would be key. A lot of the language they use was sort of feeling a bit afloat, where even the parish leaders are looking them as leaders, but they're sort of trying to figure out where to look themselves. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
For that wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.